The snap of his own rib cracking was louder than the howling wind. Leo hit the frozen asphalt hard, the taste of copper and road salt filling his mouth. He didn't scream. You didn't scream at Ravenwood. Screaming just earned you a trip to the box. Leo! Sophie's voice was thin, brittle, like dry twigs snapping. She was 12, but looked 8 in that moment, shivering in a threadbare denim jacket that offered zero protection against a Colorado blizzard. Move! Leo grunted, forcing himself up. The pain in his side was a hot knife, but the floodlights sweeping the yard were worse. The alarm klaxons of the Ravenwood State home began to wail, a mechanical shriek tearing through the whiteout. They weren't just running away from a strict orphanage. They were escaping a prison camp disguised as charity. Director Malcolm didn't just discipline kids, he broke them. And tonight, after Malcolm had shattered Leo's rib for sneaking an extra bread roll to his sister, Leo decided he'd rather freeze to death than spend another night in that hellhole. The fence, Leo wheezed, grabbing Sophie's freezing hand. Go! They scrambled over the chain-link perimeter, the metal biting into their numb fingers. They dropped into the deep snow of the tree line just as the heavy steel gates of Ravenwood groaned open behind them. Flashlight beams cut through the swirling snow like lightsabers. They're coming, Sophie sobbed, stumbling as the snow swallowed her knees. Leo, I can't feel my feet. Leo looked at the compass in his head. The town was 5 miles uphill. In this weather, a white death blizzard with a wind chill of 40 below, trying to hike to the sheriff's station was a suicide mission. Malcolm's guards would run them down with snowmobiles before they made the first mile marker. Panic tried to seize Leo's chest, but then a memory sparked, a memory of his father, Arthur, a blue-collar engineer who smelled of diesel and pipe tobacco. When the world freezes over, Leo, his dad had told him years ago, pointing at a faded topographic map. You don't fight the mountain. You follow the blood. The river is the vein. We aren't going to town, Leo yelled over the wind, pulling Sophie toward the steep embankment leading down into the ravine. We're going to the river. The river? Sophie looked at him like he was crazy. It's frozen, Leo. Trust me. They slid down the embankment, a chaotic tumble through briars and ice. When they hit the bottom, the wind died down slightly, blocked by the canyon walls. Before them lay the Black River, a ribbon of solid white ice, and there, half buried in a snowdrift like a tombstone, was the structure. It wasn't a house, it was a relic of the Rust Belt era, a red brick squat building with shattered windows and a massive rusted iron water wheel frozen mid-turn in the ice. What is that? Sophie whispered, her teeth chattering violently. Dad's old station, Leo said, limping forward. Station number 9. It looked dead. It looked haunted. But as Leo wiped the frost from a metal plaque on the door, he felt a faint vibration through the soles of his boots, a deep, dormant hum beneath the ice. The monsters were behind them. The storm was above them. But in front of them, buried under decades of neglect and ice, was their only chance at survival. Leo kicked the rotted wood of the door. Get inside, he commanded. We're waking it up. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the blizzard's scream instantly. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, industrial, and smelling of stale ozone and dead dampness. Don't sit down, Leo commanded, his voice raspy. He fumbled for the switch on his cheap plastic flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space that looked less like a shelter and more like a tomb for machines. Station number 9 was a cathedral of the Rust Belt era. Brick walls stained with decades of soot, towering windows shattered and boarded up, and in the center, the beast. It was a massive General Electric turbine, painted a peeling industrial green, bolted to the concrete floor like a captive god. It was silent, cold. Leo. Sophie's voice was slurring. That was a bad sign. He swung the light toward her. She was leaning against a rusted support column, her eyelids drooping. She had stopped shivering. Leo's stomach dropped. Hypothermia stage 2. The body stops fighting. The brain starts shutting down the lights. Sophie, look at me, Leo barked, grabbing her shoulders. He ignored the fire that shot up his own side from his cracked rib. Stay with me. You are not checking out on me. I'm just tired, she whispered, a faint, delirious smile playing on her blue lips. It's not cold anymore, Leo, it's warm. That's a lie, Leo said, his voice cracking. He dragged her toward a pile of old canvas tarps in the corner. They were stiff with grime and smelled of mildew, but they were dry. He wrapped her in them like a cocoon, layering them until she looked like a heap of rags. Count, he told her. Count backward from 100. Do it loud. 99. 98. Her voice was a ghostly whisper. Leo spun around facing the turbine. He wasn't a doctor, he was a mechanic. He couldn't fix Sophie's body, but he could fix the room. If he didn't get this generator running in the next 20 minutes, the ambient temperature, currently hovering in the single digits, would kill her before the sun came up. He moved to the control panel. It was an analog nightmare of dials and switches, labeled in the faded, utilitarian font of the 1950s. He traced the schematic etched into a brass plate. Intake, penstock, turbine, exciter, output. Simple physics, Leo muttered to himself, channeling his father's voice. Waterfalls, wheel turns, spark flies. He checked the breaker box. The fuses were ancient glass cartridges, but the filaments looked intact. The transmission line switch, the one labeled Ravenwood Auxiliary, was thrown to the off position. Malcolm, or someone before him, had manually killed the connection. But the switch didn't matter if the turbine wasn't spinning. Leo moved to the floor grate that looked down into the penstock. The channel where the river water was supposed to flow in and drive the turbine blades. He shone his light down into the abyss. Damn it! The curse echoed in the empty hall. The intake wasn't just frozen, it was choked. A massive slurry of ice chunks, driftwood, and frozen river debris had jammed the intake grate. The water wheel below was paralyzed, locked in a vice grip of winter's making. The Black River was trying to flow, but the blockage was strangling the station's throat. It was a catastrophic mechanical failure, the kind that required a crew, a winch, and daylight to fix. Leo looked back at the pile of canvas. 94, Sophie mumbled. She was losing time. Leo looked at his hands. They were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding. He looked at the crowbar hanging on the tool rack, a 3-foot bar of solid hexagonal steel. He didn't have a crew, he didn't have a winch. He had a crowbar and a cracked rib. He walked over to the tool rack and grabbed the steel bar. It was heavy, cold enough to burn his skin. Sophie, Leo said, kneeling beside the pile of canvas. She didn't answer, her eyes were closed. Sophie, he shook her hard. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Leo, I have to go outside, Leo said, his voice steady, devoid of the terror clawing at his throat. I have to clear the intake. The wheel is stuck. No, she whimpered, a spark of lucidity returning. The water, it'll kill you. The cold is killing us, Leo corrected. He grabbed a coil of yellow nylon rope from the maintenance shelf. He tied a bowline knot around his waist, cinching it tight over his jacket. He handed the other end to Sophie. You are the anchor, he said. pressing the rough rope into her numb hands. "You wrap this around that steel pillar. If I slip, if I don't come up, you hold on. You understand? You don't let go." It was a cruel thing to ask a 12-year-old girl, to make her the lifeline, but he needed her awake. He needed her to have a job. Fear was a stimulant. It would keep her heart beating. Sophie's hands trembled, but her fingers curled around the rope. The survival instinct, the same one that had gotten them over the wall, kicked in. She nodded. Leo stood up. He checked his pockets. Empty, no phone, no lighter, just him and the bar. He walked to the heavy service door that led to the external catwalk, directly above the river. "Keep counting," Leo said, not looking back. He shoved the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a sledgehammer of ice that nearly knocked him off his feet. The roar of the storm was deafening. Leo squinted against the stinging sleet, stepping out onto the rusted metal grating of the catwalk. Below him, 10 feet down, was the river. It wasn't completely frozen here. The turbulence of the jam kept it churning, but it was a black, violent slurry of slush and dark water. It looked like oil. It looked like death. The intake grate was visible, just barely, under a mountain of jagged ice and a thick pine log that had wedged itself horizontally, acting as the keystone of the blockage. Leo climbed over the railing. The wind tried to peel him off the structure. He gripped the freezing iron ladder with one hand, the crowbar in the other, and began to descend into the throat of the storm. His boots hit the slippery concrete ledge just inches above the waterline. The spray soaked his jeans instantly, freezing within seconds into a stiff, heavy armor. He looked at the jam. The log was the key. If he dislodged the log, the pressure of the river would blow the ice out, and the wheel would turn. But to get leverage, he couldn't stand on the ledge. The angle was wrong. He had to step onto the ice jam itself. "Don't think," Leo growled into the wind. "Just do the work." He stepped out onto the unstable, shifting mass of ice. It groaned under his weight. The black water swirled around his ankles, shocking him so deeply his breath seized in his lungs. He jammed the point of the crowbar under the pine log. "Come on," he gritted out, his teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. He heaved. Pain exploded in his rib cage, white hot and blinding. He screamed, the sound lost to the blizzard. He pushed through the agony, channeling every ounce of rage he had for Ravenwood, for Malcolm, for the world that had thrown them away. Crack. The log shifted an inch. The river hissed, sensing weakness. "Move," Leo roared, throwing his entire body weight against the bar. The log didn't just move, it snapped. With a sound like a cannon shot, the pressure release was instantaneous. The log gave way, and the river, unleashed, surged forward with the force of a freight train. The ice jam exploded. "Leo!" He heard Sophie scream from inside just as the floor dropped out from under him. The surge of water grabbed him, ripping his feet from the ledge. The crowbar flew from his hand. He fell into the black, freezing churn, the darkness swallowing him whole. The black water didn't feel like water. It felt like concrete wrapping around his chest, squeezing the air out of his lungs in a violent, involuntary spasm. Leo was underwater. The world was a chaotic, swirling void of bubbles and debris. The current of the black river, freed from the ice jam, was a raging bull, and it was dragging him downstream toward the jagged rocks of the falls. "Don't breathe, don't breathe." His brain screamed the command, but the cold shock response was primal. His mouth opened to gasp, inhaling a mixture of freezing slush and river grit. Panic, sharp and electric, spiked in his veins. He thrashed, his heavy boots acting like anchors dragging him toward the bottom. Jerk. The yellow nylon rope around his waist snapped tight. It hit him with enough force to bruise his ribs through his jacket, but it held. For a split second, he was suspended in the dark current, a pendulum swinging in the freezing abyss. Above him on the metal catwalk, the world was screaming. Inside the station, Sophie was no longer a 12-year-old girl. She was a counterweight. When the rope had gone taut, it had yanked her forward, slamming her small body against the rusted steel pillar she was using for leverage. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she didn't let go. She wrapped the rope around her forearms, digging her heels into the grimy concrete floor. "Leo!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. The rope vibrated in her hands, humming with the terrifying tension of the river, trying to steal her brother. She was slipping. The canvas tarps she had been wrapped in were tangled around her legs. Physics, Leo had said, leverage. Sophie grit her teeth, channeling a tenacious fury she didn't know she possessed. She jammed her foot against the base of the pillar and leaned back, using her skeletal body weight to fight the river. "I have you," she shrieked, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Climb!" Down in the dark, Leo felt the line hold. He clawed at the water, his fingers numb claws, finding the iron rungs of the maintenance ladder. He broke the surface, gasping, coughing up water and bile. The air was a knife in his lungs, but it was air. To his right, the water wheel was no longer a statue. It was moving, groan, clank. Whoosh! The massive iron wheel, liberated from the ice, began to turn. Slowly at first, shedding plates of ice like dead skin, and then gathering speed. The sound was cacophonous, the grinding of gears that hadn't moved in 20 years, the roar of water rushing into the intake, the scream of the wind. Leo hauled himself up the ladder. Every muscle in his body was seizing, locked in the rigor of thermal shock. He flopped onto the metal grating of the catwalk, retching, shaking so violently his teeth clicked together like dice in a cup. "Leo!" Sophie was at the door, pulling on the rope, dragging him across the ice-slicked metal like a wet sack of flour. He couldn't stand. His legs were useless wood. He crawled, the instinct to survive, overriding the desire to just close his eyes and sleep. He scrambled over the threshold, and Sophie slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. Under the floorboards, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began. It started as a vibration in Leo's chest, then grew into a steady, powerful hum. The General Electric turbine was spinning. Leo collapsed onto the pile of canvas tarps, curling into a fetal ball. The shivering wasn't just shaking. It was a violent convulsion, his body's desperate attempt to generate heat. "You're okay, you're okay," Sophie sobbed, her hands flying over him. She wasn't the scared little sister anymore. She was the medic. She stripped off his soaked, freezing jacket, her fingers clumsy but diligent. "The heater," Leo stammered, his jaw locking. Sophie looked at the corner of the room. The coils inside the old industrial space heater were no longer gray. They were glowing a dull, angry cherry red. And then the light. It started with a flicker. The dust-caked bulb hanging from the ceiling buzzed. Then, with a pop, it flared to life. A brilliant, warm, incandescent yellow that flooded the gloomy brick tomb. It was the most beautiful thing Leo had ever seen. "It works," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide, reflecting the golden glow. "Leo, it works." She dragged the heater closer to him, positioning the coils so the heat blasted directly onto his soaked clothes. The warmth hit him like a physical weight, a blessed, stinging wave that began to thaw the ice in his veins. They sat there for an hour, huddled together under the dirty canvas, the heater humming a song of salvation. The room, once a freezer, was slowly climbing into the 40s, Then the 50s. The air smelled of burning dust and ozone, the perfume of survival. Leo's shivering subsided to a manageable tremble. He took a deep breath. The pain in his cracked rib, a dull ache now overshadowed by the sheer relief of being alive. He looked at the machine. It was magnificent. The turbine was spinning smoothly now, the heart of the river beating strong, generating raw, unbridled power from the black water outside. "We did it," Leo rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Dad was right." Sophie handed him a dry corner of the tarp to wipe his face. "We have heat, we have light. Malcolm can't touch us here." Leo sat up, wincing. He looked at the control panel on the wall, really looking at it for the first time in the light. The needle on the voltage output gauge was pinned in the green zone. The station wasn't just generating enough power for a heater and a light bulb. It was generating megawatts. His eyes followed the thick, insulated copper cables running from the turbine, up the wall, and into a series of heavy-duty breaker switches. Most were labeled with faded marker: pump station, street lights, decommissioned, main grid. But one breaker was different. It had a metal plate riveted to it, etched with military precision. Primary feed, Ravenwood Institution. Leo's blood ran cold again, but not from the weather. The breaker was in the off position. He stood up, his legs shaky but holding. He walked to the panel. He traced the line. This station, this forgotten relic, was the original heart of the orphanage. It was the dedicated line meant to keep the children warm, free of charge, forever. And Malcolm had shut it off. "Leo?" Sophie asked, sensing the shift in his mood. She walked up beside him, the blanket draped over her shoulders like a royal cape. "He didn't just switch to the city grid for money," Leo whispered, a cynical realization darkening his face. "He cut this line so he could control the heat. He made the cold a weapon." Leo looked out the boarded window. Through a crack in the wood, he could see the hill across the river. The Ravenwood orphanage was a black silhouette against the storm. Dark, dead. The city grid had failed. The generator back at the orphanage was likely frozen or out of fuel. Malcolm, the guards, and the 100 children trapped inside. Tommy, who stuttered when he was scared. Sarah, who braided Sophie's hair. Little Ben, who still wet the bed. They were all in the dark, freezing. Leo looked at his hand. He looked at the heavy iron switch handle. He had the power, literally. He held the sun in his hands. "I could leave it off," Leo said, his voice hard. "I could let Malcolm freeze in his office. Let him feel what it's like to have your toes turn blue." It was a seductive thought, a righteous, vengeful thought. Sophie looked at the dark hill, then at the switch, and finally at her brother. She didn't scold him. She didn't preach. She just reached out and touched the scar on his hand, the one he got protecting her from a guard last year. "You're not him, Leo," she said softly. "You fix things. You don't break them." Leo looked at the switch, the Ravenwood breaker. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the warm, ozone-filled air. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was the operator. "Get ready," Leo said, gripping the handle. "We're about to wake up the ghosts." He slammed the switch up. Thunk. The sound was heavy, final. A surge of magnetic force hummed through the wall. Across the river, on the dark, frozen hill, a window flared with light. Then another, and another. The dormitory lights of Ravenwood flickered on. The beast on the hill was waking up, fed by the heart of the river and the mercy of the boy it had tried to break. 2 miles away, in the executive director's office at Ravenwood, silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Director Malcolm sat in his imported Italian leather chair, wrapped in a cashmere coat that cost more than the annual food budget for the entire boys' dormitory. The darkness was absolute. The state-of-the-art heating system he had installed and skimmed a hefty commission from was dead. The backup generators had failed an hour ago, their fuel lines gelled by the merciless cold. Malcolm poured himself a glass of scotch, his hand trembling not from fear but from a bone-deep chill. He was staring at the window, watching the blizzard bury his empire. He was thinking about the insurance payout. If the pipes burst and the building flooded, he could claim act of God. If a few of the weaker wards didn't wake up in the morning, well, that was a tragedy, but it was also a reduction in overhead costs. He took a sip. Clang. The sound came from the radiator under the window. A sharp, metallic hammer blow that made Malcolm jump, spilling amber liquid onto his frozen knuckles. Clang, hiss. Malcolm frowned. The radiator was vibrating. And then the room exploded with light. The overhead halogen fixtures flickered, buzzed, and then blazed to life with a blinding, sterile intensity. The sudden brightness was an assault. Malcolm squinted, shielding his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. Impossible, he muttered. He stood up, his breath misting in the air, and walked to the window. Below him, the sprawling complex of Ravenwood was no longer a tomb. Windows were glowing gold in the whiteout. The exterior floodlights had kicked on, carving cones of visibility through the driving snow. The heat kicked in next. A low, rushing whoosh of air from the vents. Malcolm didn't feel relief. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut. He knew the grid was down. He knew the generator was dead. There was only one other way this building got power. He looked out across the valley toward the river. Through the swirling vortex of snow, he saw it. A single, defiant point of light down by the water. The old pump station. Station number 9. No, Malcolm hissed. That place is gutted. It's dead. He grabbed his phone. No signal. He slammed it onto the desk and grabbed his walkie-talkie. Giles, get the snowmobiles! Malcolm screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a malevolent fury. Someone is at the river station. I want them out now. Back at station number 9, the atmosphere had shifted from survival to something bordering on the sacred. Leo sat on a crate near the heater, watching Sophie. She'd found a stash of emergency rations in a metal locker. Vietnam-era MREs that tasted like cardboard and salt. But to them, it was a feast. She was eating crackers with a focus that was heartbreaking to watch. The turbine continued its steady, rhythmic thrumming. It was a comforting sound, a mechanical heartbeat that said, I've got you. Leo, Sophie said, wiping crumbs from her chin. Do you think they know, the other kids? They know they're warm, Leo said, checking the pressure gauge again. That's enough. He walked over to the main window. He had boarded it up mostly, but left a small slat open for a lookout. He peered into the night. The lights of Ravenwood were visible now, a cluster of stars on the hill. It looked peaceful from here. But Leo knew better. He knew that by turning those lights on, he hadn't just saved the kids. He had rung a dinner bell for the wolves. We can't stay here, Leo said, his voice low. Malcolm will see the lights. He knows this line connects to the orphanage. But the storm? Sophie started. The storm is the only reason they aren't here yet, Leo interrupted. He picked up the crowbar, weighing it in his hand. It felt like an extension of his arm now. We need to barricade the door. If anyone comes... A flash of blue light cut through the cracks in the boarded window. Leo froze. It wasn't the steady yellow beam of a snowmobile. It was rotating, blue and red. Cops, Leo whispered. Sophie scrambled up, clutching the blanket. Is it Sheriff Burke? Will he help us? Leo's expression hardened into something cynical and far too old for a 17-year-old. Burke plays poker with Malcolm every Tuesday. He's not here to help, Soph. He's here to clean up. He grabbed Sophie and shoved her behind the massive bulk of the turbine generator. "Stay down. Do not make a sound unless I tell you." Bang, bang, bang. A heavy fist pounded on the oak door. "Sheriff's Department," a voice boomed over the wind. "Open up." Leo stood in the middle of the room, the crowbar held across his chest like a quarterstaff. He didn't move. The door handle rattled. "Locked." "I know you're in there." The voice was muffled but authoritative. "I can see the smoke from the heater vent. Open the door or I'll kick it in." Leo stayed silent. He was calculating the angles. If the door broke, he had one swing before the sheriff drew his weapon. A pause, then the sound of a boot slamming against wood. Once. Twice. The old lock, already stressed by the cold, gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung open, banging against the brick wall. Sheriff Burke stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the swirling white void. He was a bear of a man, wearing a heavy parka and a bewildered expression. His hand was hovering near the holster on his hip, but he didn't draw. He stepped inside, kicking the snow off his boots. He squinted against the warm, golden light of the station. His eyes landed on the spinning turbine, then on the glowing heater, and finally on the skinny, bruised teenager holding a crowbar with lethal intent. "Jesus, kid," Burke breathed, closing the door behind him to shut out the storm. "Put that down." "Take one more step and I'll break your knees," Leo said. His voice didn't shake. Burke held up his gloved hands. "Easy. I'm not Malcolm." "You take his money," Leo shot back. "Same thing." Burke paused, the accusation hitting him harder than the wind outside. He looked around the room, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. He looked at the control panel, at the breaker switch flipped to on. He walked slowly toward the wall, ignoring the crowbar Leo raised higher. Burke looked at the brass plaque. "Primary feed. Ravenwood Institution." "I don't understand," Burke muttered, more to himself than Leo. "Malcolm told the town council this station was scrap metal. He said the connection was severed 10 years ago. He petitioned for a grant to build a new grid." "He lied," Sophie's voice piped up. She stepped out from behind the generator, small and fierce. "He kept the line. He just turned it off so he could steal the budget money. He let us freeze to save cash." Burke looked at the little girl, then back at the humming machine. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The power failures, the budget cuts, the shivering kids he had ignored because it was state business. It was all a grift. "He's been running the orphanage on the city grid," Burke whispered, realization dawning on his face, "and pocketing the maintenance budget for the hydro station." "And now the city grid is down," Leo said, lowering the crowbar an inch but keeping his muscles coiled. "So we turned the heart back on." Burke looked at Leo with a newfound respect. This wasn't a delinquent runaway. This was a kid who had done what the entire town government couldn't do. "You realize what you've done, son?" Burke asked, his voice grave. "You just exposed $1 million fraud with a flip of a switch." "I don't care about the money," Leo spat. "I care about my sister." Suddenly, the radio on Burke's shoulder crackled to life. "Sheriff, this is dispatch. We have a 911 call from Director Malcolm. He reports an armed break-in at the old pump station. He says the suspects are sabotaging the county grid. He's en route with private security to neutralize the threat." The room went deadly silent. The hum of the turbine seemed to drop an octave. Burke stared at the radio, then at Leo. "He's coming to kill us," Leo said flatly. "He can't let us talk." Burke's face went through a complex series of emotions: confusion, denial, and finally, a hardened resolve. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Burke," he said, his eyes locked on Leo. "Disregard Malcolm. I am on the scene. The station is secure." "Copy, Sheriff. Malcolm is insisting. He says he has authority over the property. He's 2 minutes out." Burke cursed under his breath. He looked at the heavy steel door, then at the two kids who had outsmarted a blizzard and a tyrant. He unclipped his holster, but he didn't aim at Leo. He took his coat off and threw it over Sophie. "Leo," Burke said, his voice dropping into a command tone, "is there a back way out of here?" "No," Leo said, "just the river." "Then we hold the door," Burke said, drawing his service pistol and racking the slide. He moved to stand beside Leo, shoulder to shoulder. "You keep that crowbar handy, kid. It's going to be a long night." Outside, the roar of snowmobile engines began to rise above the wind, getting louder, closer, and angrier. The wolves had arrived. The silence inside the pump station was shattered by the aggressive, high-pitched whine of two-stroke engines. "Get down!" Sheriff Burke roared, shoving Sophie behind the thick cast-iron casing of the turbine. He didn't have to tell her twice. Sophie curled into a ball, clutching the dirty canvas tarp, her eyes wide and terrified. Leo didn't hide. He vaulted over the rusted railing of the control platform, crouching low behind the main breaker panel. He gripped his crowbar until his knuckles turned white. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic staccato rhythm that matched the revving engines outside. The snowmobile skidded to a halt just outside the door. The engines cut. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the relentless thrum of the turbine spinning in the center of the room and the wind whistling through the cracks in the brickwork. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that comes before a thunderclap. "Sheriff Burke," Malcolm's voice drifted through the open door, distorted by the wind but unmistakable. It was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with a sinister confidence. "I know you're in there, Jim. I saw your cruiser. You're making a mistake." Burke stayed crouched behind an overturned metal workbench, his service pistol trained on the doorway. "Go home, Malcolm," Burke shouted back, his voice steady and authoritative. "This is a crime scene, and you're the suspect." "Suspect?" Malcolm laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "I'm the legal guardian of those children, and right now, two dangerous fugitives are sabotaging state property. I have a right to protect my facility. Send the boy out, Jim. We can talk about the rest over a drink." "The only place you're going is a federal holding cell," Burke yelled. "I saw the breaker, Malcolm. I know about the fraud. It's over." There was a long pause outside. The wind howled, rattling the loose, corrugated tin on the roof. "That's unfortunate," Malcolm said, his tone shifting from persuasive to ice cold. "Boys, clear the room." Crack thwump! A flashbang grenade arced through the doorway, bouncing on the concrete floor. "Cover your ears!" Leo screamed. Bang! The explosion was deafening. A blinding white flash washed out the golden light of the station. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Smoke filled the air, acrid and stinging. Through the haze, shadows moved. 3 men in tactical snow gear, Malcolm's private security goons, stormed the entrance. They weren't police, they were mercenaries on a payroll holding tactical shotguns. "Drop it," one of them shouted. "Popee-pop?" Burke didn't hesitate. He fired 2 controlled shots. The lead mercenary yelled, clutching his thigh, and crumbled to the floor. The other 2 scrambled for cover behind the heavy brick pillars near the entrance. "Suppressive fire!" Malcolm screamed from outside. The room erupted into chaos. Buckshot hammered the brick walls, sending chips of red clay and dust flying like shrapnel. Sparks showered down as a stray pellet hit a junction box. Leo crawled along the metal grating of the catwalk, staying low. He wasn't a soldier. He couldn't shoot back. But this was his station. He knew every bolt, every valve, every pressure point. He looked at the mercenaries. They were clustered near the intake pipe, using the darkness of the corner for cover. The steam bypass. Leo's eyes darted to a wheel valve painted emergency red, located on a pipe running directly above the entrance. It was the manual release for the turbine's excess pressure. "Hey!" Leo shouted, standing up from behind the control panel. The mercenaries turned their weapons toward him. "Leo, get down!" Burke screamed, firing blindly to draw their attention. Leo didn't duck. He swung the crowbar. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the valve wheel. Clang. The steel bar connected with the rusted iron wheel. It spun. Hiss, roar. A jet of superheated steam erupted from the bypass vent, screaming like a banshee. It blasted downward, directly onto the mercenaries' position. Ah! The men screamed, dropping their weapons and scrambling back toward the door, blinded and scalded by the white-hot vapor. The room filled with a thick, opaque fog, reducing visibility to zero. "Sophie, stay put!" Leo yelled, dropping back into a crouch. The steam cloud was their cover, but it was also a trap. Leo couldn't see Burke. He couldn't see the door. Suddenly a shadow loomed out of the white mist. It wasn't a mercenary, it was Malcolm. The director had entered the fray. He wore a heavy fur-lined parka and held a silver revolver, a gentleman's gun, elegant and lethal. His face was twisted in a rictus of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like a bureaucrat anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. He spotted Burke, who was reloading behind the workbench, coughing in the steam. Malcolm raised the gun. "No!" Leo didn't think. He launched himself from the catwalk. He tackled Malcolm, slamming into the man's midsection. They hit the concrete hard. The revolver skid across the floor, vanishing into the steam. Leo was 17, wiry, and fueled by a lifetime of resentment. Malcolm was 40, heavy, and soft. But Malcolm had desperation. He drove a knee into Leo's stomach. Leo gasped, the air leaving his lungs. Malcolm grabbed a handful of Leo's hair and slammed his head against the floor. Stars exploded in Leo's vision. "You ungrateful little rat," Malcolm spat, his hands closing around Leo's throat. "I gave you a roof. I gave you a bed." Leo clawed at Malcolm's leather gloves. His vision was tunneling. He couldn't breathe. The sound of the turbine was a distant roar. Bang. The gunshot was loud, singular, and distinct. Malcolm froze. His grip on Leo's throat loosened. He looked down. A small red flower was blooming on the shoulder of his expensive cashmere coat. Malcolm slumped to the side, groaning in shock. Leo scrambled backward, gasping for air, coughing violently. He looked up. Sophie was standing 10 feet away. She was holding Burke's service pistol with both hands. The gun was shaking violently, the recoil having nearly knocked her over. She looked terrified, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. But she was standing her ground. Burke emerged from the steam, limping, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He gently took the gun from Sophie's trembling hands. "It's okay, sweetheart," Burke whispered, engaging the safety. "You did good." He walked over to Malcolm, who was writhing on the floor, clutching his shoulder. Burke kicked Malcolm onto his back and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Malcolm," Burke panted, snapping the cuffs tight. "You have the right to remain silent. And I highly suggest you use it, because if you say one more word, I might forget I'm a cop." The station fell silent, save for the hissing steam and the rhythmic thrum of the generator. Leo crawled over to Sophie. She collapsed into his arms, burying her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. "I shot him," she cried. "Leo, I shot him." "You saved me," Leo whispered, stroking her hair, his own hands shaking. "You saved us all." Burke dragged Malcolm to the wall and propped him up. He checked the wound. Through and through. He'll live to stand trial. The mercenaries outside had fled, the sound of their snowmobiles fading into the distance. They were hired guns. They didn't get paid enough to fight a sheriff in a steam-powered death trap. Leo stood up, his legs wobbling. He walked to the window. The steam was clearing. The storm outside was breaking. The wind had died down to a whisper, And then he saw it. On the other side of the river, lights were moving. Not the blue lights of the police. These were yellow. Headlights, flashlights, lanterns. A convoy of vehicles was snaking its way down the snowy access road from the town. Trucks, SUVs, snowplows. "Sheriff," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "Look." Burke limped to the window. The townspeople were coming. They had seen the light. The beacon of station number 9 shining in the darkness had drawn them in. They were coming to see what had broken the night. "They see us," Burke said, a tired smile touching his lips. "The whole damn world sees us now." Leo turned back to the control panel. The needle on the gauge was steady. The Ravenwood breaker was still flipped on. Malcolm groaned on the floor, defeated and small. The monster was in chains, but the real victory wasn't the handcuffs. It was the hum of the wire. "It's not over yet," Leo said, looking at the door. "We have to explain this." Burke clapped a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "Don't worry, son. The evidence is glowing on that hill, and the man who tried to hide it is bleeding on the floor. I think the town is going to be very interested in what you have to say." Leo looked at Sophie. She wasn't crying anymore. She was looking at the heater, basking in the warmth they had fought for. They had held the line. The siege was broken. Now the sun was about to rise. The sun didn't just rise over the Black River. It broke the horizon like a hammer, shattering the gray grip of the white death. When the heavy oak door of station number 9 finally swung open, the blizzard was gone. In its place was a world scrubbed clean by ice and wind, sparkling under a resplendent, piercing blue sky. Leo stood in the doorway, shielding his eyes against the glare. Behind him, the General Electric turbine continued its steady, industrious hum, the heartbeat that had kept the darkness at bay. The convoy of vehicles that had gathered outside wasn't an angry mob. It was a congregation. Dozens of townspeople stood in the knee-deep snow. There were utility workers in high-vis vests, neighbors in heavy parkas, and families who had seen the lights of the orphanage flicker back on in the middle of the night. They stared at the old brick station, then at the steam venting from the roof, and finally at the 2 shivering, soot-stained kids standing next to Sheriff Burke. They didn't see runaways or delinquents. They saw survivors. Sheriff Burke walked Silas Malcolm out. The director was no longer the imposing tyrant in a cashmere coat. Handcuffed, slumped over, and bleeding onto his expensive scarf, he looked diminished. A small, petty man exposed by the morning light. As deputies shoved Malcolm into the back of a cruiser, a hush fell over the crowd. The contrast was stark. The man who had stolen the town's warmth for profit was now cold and in chains, while the boy he had beaten was standing tall in the doorway of the power plant he had resurrected. A woman from the crowd, Mrs. Higgins, the owner of the local diner, stepped forward. She didn't say a word. She just walked up to Sophie and wrapped a thick, hand-knitted quilt around the girl's shoulders. Then she handed Leo a thermos of steaming coffee. "Black," she said, a small, gracious smile crinkling her eyes. "Just like your dad used to drink it." Leo took the thermos. The heat seeped into his frozen gloves. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Burke turned to address the crowd. "Folks," he boomed, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "I want you to know something. The grid didn't fix itself last night. The reason the kids up at Ravenwood are safe this morning, the reason we aren't pulling bodies out of that dormitory, is because of Leo and Sophie." He put a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "Arthur would have been proud, son. You're a hell of an engineer." Leo looked at the station. The red brick walls, the spinning water wheel, the copper wires singing with voltage, It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a fortress. It was a home. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, looking up at Burke. "Do we have to go back to a new home?" Burke looked at the station, then at the faces of the townspeople who were nodding in silent agreement. "I don't think so," Burke said, a resolute glint in his eye. "This station is municipal property, but it requires a specialized operator, someone who knows the machinery, someone who lives on site." He looked at Leo. "I think the town council is going to have an emergency meeting to hire a new station master, and I think the position comes with full custody of his minor sister." Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the river. The ice was broken, churned up by the power of the wheel. The water was flowing free. They weren't orphans running in the dark anymore. They were the keepers of the light. Leo put his arm around Sophie, pulling her close. They had walked through the fire and the ice, and they had come out the other side. "We're home, Soph," Leo said. "We're finally home. What about you? If you were in Leo's boots, standing in that control room with your hand on the breaker, would you have flipped the switch, knowing the man who tortured you was freezing in the dark? Would you have chosen vengeance? Or would you have chosen mercy to save the innocent?" Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know if you'd be the wolf or the shepherd. And if this story warmed your heart, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Join our community, because in a world that's getting colder every day, we need to keep the lights on for each other. See you in the next story. Stay warm. The sun didn't just rise over the Black River. It broke the horizon like a hammer, shattering the gray grip of the white death. When the heavy oak door of station number 9 finally swung open, the blizzard was gone. In its place was a world scrubbed clean by ice and wind, sparkling under a resplendent, piercing blue sky. Leo stood in the doorway, shielding his eyes against the glare. Behind him, the General Electric turbine continued its steady, industrious hum, the heartbeat that had kept the darkness at bay. The convoy of vehicles that had gathered outside wasn't an angry mob, it was a congregation. Dozens of townspeople stood in the knee-deep snow. There were utility workers in high-vis vests, neighbors in heavy parkas, and families who had seen the lights of the orphanage flicker back on in the middle of the night. They stared at the old brick station, then at the steam venting from the roof, and finally at the 2 shivering, soot-stained kids standing next to Sheriff Burke. They didn't see runaways or delinquents. They saw survivors. Sheriff Burke walked Silas Malcolm out. The director was no longer the imposing tyrant in a cashmere coat. Handcuffed, slumped over, and bleeding onto his expensive scarf, he looked diminished, a small, petty man exposed by the morning light. As deputies shoved Malcolm into the back of a cruiser, a hush fell over the crowd. The contrast was stark. The man who had stolen the town's warmth for profit was now cold and in chains, while the boy he had beaten was standing tall in the doorway of the power plant he had resurrected. A woman from the crowd, Mrs. Higgins, the owner of the local diner, stepped forward. She didn't say a word. She just walked up to Sophie and wrapped a thick, hand-knitted quilt around the girl's shoulders. Then she handed Leo a thermos of steaming coffee. "Black," she said, a small, gracious smile crinkling her eyes. "Just like your dad used to drink it." Leo took the thermos. The heat seeped into his frozen gloves. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Burke turned to address the crowd. "Folks," he boomed, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "I want you to know something. The grid didn't fix itself last night. The reason the kids up at Ravenwood are safe this morning, the reason we aren't pulling bodies out of that dormitory, is because of Leo and Sophie." He put a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. Arthur would have been proud, son. You're a hell of an engineer. Leo looked at the station, the red brick walls, the spinning water wheel, the copper wires singing with voltage. It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a fortress. It was a home. What happens now? Sophie asked, looking up at Burke. Do we have to go back to a new home? Burke looked at the station, then at the faces of the townspeople who were nodding in silent agreement. I don't think so, Burke said, a resolute glint in his eye. This station is municipal property, but it requires a specialized operator, someone who knows the machinery, someone who lives on site. He looked at Leo. I think the town council is going to have an emergency meeting to hire a new station master, and I think the position comes with full custody of his minor sister. Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the river. The ice was broken, churned up by the power of the wheel. The water was flowing free. They weren't orphans running in the dark anymore. They were the keepers of the light. Leo put his arm around Sophie, pulling her close. They had walked through the fire and the ice, and they had come out the other side. We're home, Soph, Leo said. We're finally home. What about you? If you were in Leo's boots, standing in that control room with your hand on the breaker, would you have flipped the switch? Knowing the man who tortured you was freezing in the dark, would you have chosen vengeance? Or would you have chosen mercy to save the innocent? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know if you'd be the wolf or the shepherd. And if this story warmed your heart, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Join our community, because in a world that's getting colder every day, we need to keep the lights on for each other. See you in the next story. Stay warm.